Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for being here. There are great temptations outdoors today, and so I especially appreciate your willingness to come, and I hope receive a little bit of nourishment for the mind instead. I think where I'll begin is to simply note that many of us would say that American politics is in a parlous state. We've had 20 years of threats, sometimes acted upon, to shut down the government over budget disputes. We've recently had threats to default on the federal debt. We have a majority party in the US Congress that insists on repeal of Obamacare as its highest priority. And we have an inability of the two parties to work together to do much of anything to face up to many of the most pressing problems of the United States, everything from immigration to the recent bill on human trafficking, which was delayed for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks because of disputes between the two parties. What I'm going to do today is to talk about what exactly that looks like. What is it? What is the kind of dysfunction that lies at the middle of Washington these days? How is it that we can sort of understand its sources? How is it that we can sort of understand the effects that it has on our politics? But I'm not going to just talk about Washington. I'm also going to talk about the country. Because the dysfunction in Washington didn't just arise on its own. It arose because it's related to some changes, some important changes that have happened in the American electorate over the last 50 or 60 years. And so where I'm going to start first is by looking at politics in Washington, at partisan polarization in Washington. And from there, I'm then going to go to talk a little bit about partisan polarization in the electorate. I'll also talk a little bit about where that comes from. How is it that our politics has become so polarized? What were kind of the things that moved the public in the kind of directions that it was moved? And then finally, I'm going to close on a bit of an optimistic note. I'm going to close with the notion that there are important things that we can see in the public today that give cause for believing that partisan polarization, at least in the electorate, and therefore in Congress, therefore in Washington, is not going to last forever. The caveat, however, is to note that it's not going to change overnight. It's something that's going to take as long to get out of as it took us to get into it. So let me begin our story then in Washington. This particular figure shows party unity votes in Congress. This is something that's been kept track of by an organization called Congressional Quarterly, which publishes information about the US Congress on a regular basis. And what this represents is the number of roll call votes in the House of Representatives, in the solid line, and in the Senate, in the dotted line, in which a majority of one party oppose a majority of the other party. And the important thing to see about partisan polarization in Washington is that there's been a steady increase, particularly since the 1970s. So where in the 1960s, about 45% or so on average of the votes that were taken in the US Congress were party unity votes. That had actually dropped in the late 60s and early 70s into the kind of 35% range. But since then it has increased fairly steadily up to the mid 50% mark or so in the early 2000s. And then as you can see, it's taken another jump upward. So what we're seeing is it's increasingly the case that votes in Washington pit one party or a majority of one party against a majority of the other party. So we've seen a growing incidence of partisan division in Congress. We've also seen a growing readiness of members of Congress to support their parties on party unity votes. And so this figure essentially shows for Republicans and Democrats separately, Democrats in the familiar blue, Republicans in the familiar red. It shows Democrats and Republicans separately, and these are the percentage of Republicans or the percentage of Democrats who join their party on these party unity votes. As you can see, there was a kind of lull in the 1960s and 1970s where that percentage was in this kind of 75% range. And since then has risen very steadily, both in the House and in the Senate. Until now, it's roughly in the 90% range, where 90% of the Democrats will support the Democratic Party on party unity votes and 90% of Republicans. There's actually another interesting pattern here that you can see on the House side, and that is that the majority party is more unified than the minority party. And there's a reason for that, it turns out, and the reason for that is the majority party controls the agenda. And if you control the agenda, you're going to want to bring things to the floor of the House that your people support. You're not going to worry about whether the opposition party supports them or not. And so you're going to bring things up that are going to have appeal to the opposition party perhaps, but certainly appeal to your own members. So basically, we've not only seen rising unity of the two parties, we've also seen a rising likelihood of members of Congress supporting their own party on roll call votes. And the question then is why? Well, yes?
The Southern Democrat line
Yes.
in the last chart,
Right.
those Southern Democrats are included as all Democrats.
Yes, they are.
In the upper line.
That's right.
Without them, that line, especially in the late 50s up to the mid 80s, would be higher.
Yes, yes. The Southern Democrats were pulling down the party unity in the 1960s and 1970s, and the Southern Democrats will be an important part of our story as we go along further today. So we've seen rising party unity in Congress. We've seen rising kind of party loyalty in votes in Congress. And why is that? Well, the answer is that the two parties over time have diverged from each other ideologically, that is in terms of their policy positions, and I'll also show they've become more homogeneous in their policy views over the last 50 years or so. So this is something that's actually begun to get some attention in the press. But these show the positions of Republicans and Democrats broken out by Southern and Northern Democrats over a long period of time. You can see that the figure goes back to 1879. So these are the average positions on a kind of left-right party dimension. So let me tell you a little bit about where these come from. These are based on roll call votes. And there's a guy at the University of California at San Diego, Keith Poole, who has been doing studies of these for years and years and years. And so what he has is a kind of scaling device where he's able to take these roll call votes and sort of turn them into a common policy dimension. And so what one sees here is that for a very long time, the Republicans were actually becoming a more moderate party. Okay, and the Democrats likewise were becoming a more moderate party. And so there's a period there really from the start of the New Deal up until the late 1970s, early 1980s, where the two parties really were not very far apart, at least in terms of the average positions of their members. But starting in the early 1980s, the Republicans moved sharply to the right as a party in Congress. That is, the preferences of Republicans in Congress move sharply to the right, and the preferences of Democrats drift to the left. And you'll notice that most of the movement actually is Republicans rather than Democrats. Moreover, the parties not only separate, but the parties also become more homogeneous. And so this actually shows the distribution, right? The middle of this distribution, it's a unimodal distribution, so the middle is actually pretty close to the mode in this particular case. You can see that in the 93rd House from 1973 to 1974, there was considerable overlap between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, that is, there was a considerable number, there's a considerable bulge actually of conservative Democrats who are in the middle of the political spectrum, and for that matter, there were not an inconsiderable number of liberal or moderate Republicans who overlapped each other in terms of their policy views. If you compare that then to the 108th House in 2003 and 2004, you'll notice two things. One is that those distributions have moved apart. Okay, so that the Republicans are now to the right of where they were 30 years ago, and the Democrats are to the left of where they were 30 years ago. Okay. The second thing you'll notice is that there is no middle anymore. That is, where there used to be a considerable number of Democrats who were actually to the right of many Republicans, and a considerable number of Republicans who were to the left of Democrats, that's no longer the case. And in fact, we can see this in dramatic fashion by going back to the Poole and Rosenthal data here. This shows the percentage of members who overlap the other party on this liberal and conservative dimension. And so you'll see here that for a period of time, again, from the 1930s into the early into the mid-1980s, there were a considerable number of Democrats and Republicans, both in the House and the Senate, whose policy positions overlapped each other. As you'll see, however, at the very end of this, starting in the mid-2000s, during the George W. Bush administration, it quickly became the case, both in the House and the Senate, that the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican, okay? And the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. There is no overlap at all anymore. It used to be there were a few. Ben Nelson from Nebraska was the last senator, actually, who was in the overlap, along with Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania. When Arlen Specter switched parties, that ended that. So we now have a situation, we have a situation with multiple characteristics. One is the two parties have moved apart in their policy views. The second is that both parties have become more homogeneous in their policy views. so that the Democratic Party is much more a liberal party in Congress, and the Republican Party is much more a conservative party than it was before in Congress. And the third thing that's happened is that the middle has disappeared. There are no longer any people in the middle of the partisan distribution. So what are the consequences of that then? Yes?
Undoubtedly, you're going to draw this in a few minutes, but what has happened to public opinion over that same time period?
I'll be getting that directly. Okay, just a second. Okay. So what has been the effect of this on our politics? Well, the first thing that's had an effect on our politics is that it has greatly complicated leadership by the president and greatly complicated the ability to create action in support of the president's policy positions. As you can see here, the percentage passed of the president's legislation has always depended upon whether the president's party also controls the Congress or not. Okay. But what has happened over time is that partisan control of the Congress has mattered more and more and more to the likelihood that the Congress will actually approve the positions of the president. So let me make two comparisons here. One is the Nixon administration. Richard Nixon was the first president in American history who, during none of his term, had a majority of the U.S. Congress. First in U.S. history, right? So the first one who never had a majority in Congress. As you can see, that did not stop Nixon from having a fair bit of success in passing his program, both in the House and in the Senate. So you can see there that Nixon was getting about 70% of his program passed, and it wasn't, it wasn't markedly different until Watergate brought him down in 1974. Compare that then to Bill Clinton. Clinton, as you'll remember, his party, the Democratic Party, controlled the Congress for the first 2 years of his term. And then Clinton became the first president since Woodrow Wilson to have a divided Congress. Okay, first Democratic president to have a divided Congress where the Republicans controlled the House and the Senate after the 1994 elections. And as you can see, Clinton was enormously successful in the first 2 years of his term and enormously unsuccessful in the last 6 years of his term. Only about 50% of his policies passed the U.S. Congress, about 55 or 60% in the House, in the Senate, and about 40 or 45% in the House. That then leads to a situation like we observed with Barack Obama. So in the first year of Barack Obama's term, 2009, Barack Obama passed more of his legislation than any president in American history, even more than Lyndon Johnson in 1965. So he was the most successful president since Lyndon Johnson, okay, the most successful president ever in passing his policy program. And as you can see, in 2013 and 2014, okay, that changed. Okay, and in particular, once we had that Democratic House, or that Republican House that came in the 2010 elections, the support in the House for Barack Obama's program plunged to historic lows, even lower than George W. Bush's success with Congress in the last 2 years of his term when the Democrats controlled the Congress. And so this polarization between the two parties, the kind of divergence of their policy positions, their greater homogeneity, their greater unity around policy, have all had the effect of making it more difficult for the president to pass his program. And the reason for that, of course, is that the president gets enormous support for his program from members of his own party and gets very little support from the members of the opposite party. So this is a really nice graph because it basically shows that where you stand depends on where you sit. Your willingness to support the president's party depends upon whether the president shares your partisanship or not. And what's interesting about this is two things. One is that the members of the majority party over time have become somewhat, or shall we say the members of the president's party over time have become somewhat more likely to support the president's program. What's really happened over time is the members of the opposition party have become much more unwilling to support the president's program. So whereas there was only about a 10 percentage point difference during the Eisenhower administration between the likelihood that a Democrat would vote for the president's program and that a Republican would vote for the president's program, by the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, that difference had increased to 30%. 30% more likely, Republicans were 30% more likely to support Reagan or the first Bush's policies than Democrats were, now out to 60% or 65% in the second Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, and the Barack Obama administration. Same is true of the Senate. The last thing, though, that's happened, and this is something that helps to account for some of the kind of unpleasant tone, shall we say, that has been emanating from Washington, is that the party leadership has changed. This is one of my favorite Jeff McNelly cartoons. Jeff McNelly was a longtime cartoonist for the Chicago Tribune. And this is the new model of congressional leadership starting in the 1990s. The little figure over in the lower right, in case you can't read on his shield, is Gingrich Khan. So this was when Newt Gingrich became the Republican whip, actually, before he became Speaker with the turnover in 1994. And as you can see, he's in there to crack the whip on the incoming Republican majority and to get them to sort of pay attention. Well, this was something that actually the Republican leadership in the 1990s gave a big push to, a much more kind of aggressive partisan program than had been the case before, but they actually weren't the first ones. This was something that was already happening as early as the Jim Wright speakership in the mid-1980s when Tip O'Neill resigned from Congress and his position was taken over by Jim Wright. Jim Wright pursued a much more aggressive kind of partisan program than Tip O'Neill had. And so in both parties, as both parties have become more homogeneous, they've also become more willing to delegate more authority to their party leadership. So the party leadership now has more control over its membership than it has in the recent past. So as I indicated, these changes did not occur on their own. And in fact, they've been enabled and they've been reinforced by change in the American electorate. And the kind of change I'm going to focus on in particular is the partisan identification of the American electorate. So let me say a little bit about partisan identification. Partisan identification is something that political scientists have been sort of developing as a concept since about the 1950s. And we've discovered some really amazing things about partisan identification. The first is that it's an identification that turns out to be fairly deep-seated. So people tend to adopt their partisanship in their late teens and early 20s as they enter the electorate. And once they reach about the age of 30, partisan identification is actually pretty resistant to change. There are some people who go from being Democrats to being Republicans. There are some people who go from being Republicans to being Democrats, but it doesn't happen very much. And in fact, it's much more durable than any other political attitude that people have. So partisan identification is something that actually sort of matters a lot to people, and it's a fairly robust attitude that people have. The second thing to know about partisan identification is that it is what most voters use to find their way in politics. That is, everything that they see, whether it's candidates, who of course have a party label on them, Democrat or Republican, or if it's issues, okay, which are associated with one side or the other, whatever it is, in fact, ordinary voters, most voters actually use their partisanship to evaluate those objects, okay? And so in fact, they kind of respond to these partisan messages. That's the way they sort of find themselves in politics. That's the way they know what they support and what they don't. That is, their policy views actually are less influential on their partisanship than their partisanship is on their policy views. And we have a lot of evidence in that direction. So what I'm going to be developing here are some important changes in the way that the electorate is oriented toward politics. So to begin our story, I'm going to take you back to the Edenic days of the 1970s. You remember those days of Vietnam, stagflation, lines at the gas pump, and Watergate. In the 1970s, the American National Election Studies, where all these data will come from, began to ask a question about people's ideology. They asked people to put themselves on a 7-point scale from liberal to conservative. And this simply breaks down the people who said that they were Democrats in contrast to the people who said that they were Republicans according to what their ideology was. A couple things to note here. The first is that, in fact, Republicans, people who thought of themselves as Republicans, also were more likely to think of themselves as conservatives, and people who thought of themselves as liberals were also more likely to be Democrats. Okay, no surprises there. The second thing to note, though, is in the 1970s, the modal Democrat and the modal Republican was a moderate. Okay, so the two parties in the electorate were moderate parties. Okay, they were parties of centrists, basically. Yes, it was the case that the Republicans were a little more conservative and the Democrats were a little more liberal, but the modal political position for voters for the Democrats and for the Republicans was very much in the center. So now fast forward 30 years to the mid-2000s, and we see a couple of things. The first is we can see that both parties, that the electorate, that the people who identify as Democrats have moved to the left in distribution, and the people who identify as Republicans have moved to the right. And as we saw in Congress, the movement to the right by Republicans has been much more than the movement to the left by Democrats. Okay, so that's also been reflected in the electorate. The second thing to note is that the overlap between the two political parties in the electorate has also diminished considerably. Okay, whereas there was considerable overlap between the two parties in the middle in the 1970s, by the time we get up to 2004 to 2008, there are relatively many fewer conservative Democrats, and there are many fewer liberal and moderate Republicans. And so there's been greater differentiation of policy views within the parties. That is, there's been a polarization of the electorate in parallel with the polarization of the elected officials in Washington. And we can see this in different ways as well. Liberals are becoming much more likely to identify themselves as Democrats. Conservatives much more and more likely to designate themselves conservatives much more likely to designate themselves to be Republicans. It's also had an effect on people's vote choices. So in the 1970s, the connection between people's partisan identification and the choices that they made in elections was actually kind of rough. That is, Democrats and Republicans, especially Democrats, were fairly likely to actually cross over and vote for candidates of the other party. As you can see here, this is the percentage of liberals and conservatives who told us that they voted for the Democratic congressional candidate. And as you can see, the percentage of liberals who supported the Democratic congressional candidate has risen slightly. The proportion of conservatives who supported the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Congress has gone down quite a lot. And you'll notice when it goes down most of all, in 1994, when the Republicans took over the U.S. Congress for the first time in 40 years. So there's been a major effect as well on voter choice. Likewise, after a period of years where people were more and more likely to actually defect from their own party in voting in House elections, people are more and more likely to support their own party's nominee. So the bottom bar here is the people who are party line voters. They're people whose choices in congressional elections are the same as their partisanship. The people in the kind of dotted, the kind of center line there are defectors, people who basically vote for a Republican if they're Democrat, or if they're Republican, they vote for a Democrat. And then finally, pure independents, which, as you'll notice, have not increased at all over this 40-year period. That is, the percentage of people who really are independents and who don't lean one way or another in politics is less than 10% and has been for a very long time. And so what is the effect then of that on national politics? Well, this is the last thing I'll show you about voters. This is presidential approval by party. So since the 1930s, the Gallup organization has been asking people, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Barack Obama is doing as president? And so this basically divides out Republicans and Democrats in answer to that question. Unsurprisingly, Democrats are more likely to support the party, a Democratic president, and Republicans are more likely to support a Republican president. No surprise in that. But once again, you'll see that the gap between Republicans and Democrats in their support for the president has increased markedly over this period. So whereas for Harry Truman and for Dwight Eisenhower, there's about a 30 to 40% difference in the percentage of Republicans who said that they supported the president's policies, and the percentage of Democrats who said that they supported the president's policies. And then we fast forward to the Bush and Obama administrations, and we see now that that gap has increased to 50 to 60%. Okay, so it is now the case that Republicans are about 60% less likely to support the policies of Barack Obama than Democrats are, and the same was true vice versa during the George W. Bush administration. And so we saw in the previous slide, that Democratic and Republican representatives in Congress have diverged more and more in their willingness to support the president on policy. Well, in part what they're doing is they're representing their constituents. Because what we're seeing here is that in fact constituents themselves, voters themselves, have become much more polarized as well in their patterns of support for the policies of our president. So what happened and what comes next? Well, first of all, what happened? How did we get here? So when I started graduate school in the mid-1980s, it was said about US politics, there's no difference between the two parties. They're Tweedledum and Tweedledee. There's no passion in politics, right? Nobody's really excited about anything in politics. Everybody's kind of cynical about politics. Okay. There's no choice. There's only an echo, right? That is, you can vote for the Democrat or Republican, it's not going to make any difference because they're pretty much all the same. Well, that was a long time ago. Okay, that was a long time ago. So what has changed? Well, one thing that's changed significantly over that time is what I want to call the baseline partisanship of the electorate. So these are simply the percentage of the electorate who call themselves Democrats or Republicans or independents. The thing to note here is that this is national partisanship. The thing to note here is that the percentage of the electorate that identifies with the Democratic Party has been declining steadily since the 1950s. Okay. And the percentage of the electorate that identifies with the Republican Party has risen over that time, and particularly sharply in the 1980s. Okay. And we'll talk about why it was in that time in just a moment. So the main influence on the way that voters view the world, okay, the main influence on the outcomes of elections has gone to a situation where the Democrats once had a very large advantage in partisan identification to where the Democrats have either a small advantage or none at all. This particular source, the American National Election Studies, probably overestimates the Democratic partisanship, underestimates the Republican partisanship. It's more or less the case that the electorate is about evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. But at least according to the American National Election Study, there's about a 20% advantage for the Democrats in the 1950s and 1960s, and today that's more like 8% advantage for the Democrats. But this has not been perfectly uniform across the country. So this is baseline partisanship by region, looking first at the North, Midwest, and West. And what you'll notice here is that there actually hasn't been that much change in the partisan balance outside of the South. Okay, that is, there has been a bit of a decline in Democratic identification, and there was at least a brief, but notice brief, increase in Republican identification in the 1980s and 1990s. But what's remarkable about this is that outside the South, there hasn't been very much change at all in the partisan balance. In the South, however, there's been enormous change. So in the 1950s, 85% or so of voters in the South said that they were Democrats, and only about 15% said that they were Republicans. That has now gotten to the point where actually, if this were something that were a little bit more, less kind of pro-democratic in its kind of biases, would probably show that in the South now there are more Republicans than there are Democrats. But it's certainly the case that they're about equally matched now in their partisan in the partisan balance. So what happened? Well, what happened is what political scientists call a political realignment. Sometimes there have been very dramatic political realignments, such as in the 1930s, where the balance of power between the two parties just shifts enormously in a very brief amount of time. This is more what we would call a secular realignment. So it's a kind of slow secular change, sort of change in the balance of power, and particularly in the South. And so why did that occur? Well, of course, the reason everybody will immediately point to is race. Okay, that the South, as the Democratic Party became more associated with policies of racial justice and racial equality, the South said basically, we're not interested in that party anymore. And that's certainly a big piece of it. There's not to be denied that that's a piece of it. That together with the things that have oftentimes come along with race, issues like crime and law and order and so forth. But that's not the only story. It's not the only story. In the 1930s, the Democratic Party became associated with sort of urban liberalism in a way that it had never been before. And in fact, the first big crack in the Solid South was in 1928, when Herbert Hoover nearly captured a majority of the electoral vote in the southern states. Okay, oftentimes forgotten. What was that about? It wasn't about race. Okay, it was about prohibition. It was about these kind of social issues. It was about whether the rights of labor should be more respected or not. That was what it's about. So that was a piece of it as well. There were also elements of religiosity and secularism. And then finally, whether our foreign policy should be a muscular foreign policy, whether we should be aggressively intervening in foreign affairs, or whether we should take a more multilateral approach and be less likely to apply force in politics. So over time, what this shows is that basically there was a great sort. Okay. The important thing to keep in mind when we look at this change over time is that even though the balance in the electorate is changing, it's not changing because people are changing their minds. It's changing primarily because new people are coming in the electorate and other people are leaving the electorate, usually involuntarily. So in political change, most political change occurs between generations. If we look at these data over time, and people have done this, it turns out that Southern Democratic voters, older voters in the South, actually changed very little in their propensity to support a Democratic, even presidential candidate, over this long period of time. What changed was that their children came in and became Republicans instead of being Democrats. And so essentially generational replacement is a big part of this story. And that then had an effect on the balance of power within these different regions. In the South, as you can see, the number of House seats went up in the South. The number of those House seats held by Democrats went down. In New England and the Mid-Atlantic, on the other hand, the Democrats held steady in terms of the number of their House seats, but the proportion went up because the number of House seats in New England and Mid-Atlantic states went down. And then finally, as you know, out here on the Pacific Coast, rising Democratic representation in Congress, but not nearly as large as the change that has occurred in the South. So that's another useful thing to know about partisan change, is that sometimes partisan change happens because of migration. So one of the things that's happened in the United States over time has been migration away from the kind of traditional areas of Democratic strength in the Northeast and the Midwest, and toward the West and the Southwest and the Southeast instead. So there's a political scientist named Nelson Polsby, who taught at Berkeley, who once said that the entire story of political change in the United States was air conditioning. That by making it possible to actually live in the South, it caused people to move to the South, and that accelerated the political changes that were going on there. So let's look ahead then to the future. The argument I've made is that the way that political change has occurred in the past is primarily through generational replacement. New voters coming in who have political positions and political partisanship that's different from the voters that they replaced. And that's what the future looks like as well. So I'm going to return then to the baseline partisanship of the electorate. So we're going to start here. As you can see, we've had a fairly steady state in the balance of power between the two parties now for about 25 years. Starting since the 1980s, when there was kind of an abrupt movement toward the Republican Party in the early 1980s. National partisanship hasn't changed very much at all. But as we've also seen, that also masks some pretty significant changes in the electorate at the regional level. And sometimes that change has been quite direct. So for instance, there is a Republican congressman from North Carolina, Walter B. Jones Jr., who replaced his father in Congress. Walter B. Jones Sr. was a Democrat. There's a Republican from Texas, Blake Farenthold. His grandmother, his step-grandmother, was a member of the Democratic National Committee. And it's worked on the other side as well. So the famous La Follette family in Wisconsin, Republicans, progressive Republicans in the 19-teens and 1920s. The new La Follettes in politics are all Democrats. So these are different electorates over time. And then the question is, well, what's the different electorate going to look like in the future? Well, the way we can tell that is basically to look at what partisanship breaks down to within cohorts. So it's a different kind of graph now. Instead of time as our independent variable, this is birth cohort. So along the bottom are grouped by decades, people who were born in the same decade. Okay? And the breakdown in partisanship between Democratic and Republican and independent, okay, for people who were born, say, in that first case, between 1891 and 1900. So there are people who were born between 1891 and 1900. A couple things to notice about this. You'll see that the peak level of Democratic identification was in the cohort that was born in 1911 to 1920. So remember, in this period of time, you had to be 21 years of age to vote, okay, in this period. All right. So someone who was born in 1911, when did they become eligible to vote for the first time? 1932. What's significant about 1932? The election of Franklin Roosevelt and the most successful Democratic president of the 20th century. Okay. The peak years of Republican partisanship, the peak cohort for Republican partisanship are the 1961 to 1970 cohort, which cohort, by the way, includes Barack Obama, who was born in 1961 in Hawaii. Okay. By this time, of course, you could vote at age 18. And if you voted for the first time at age 18, you're born in 1961, what was the first presidential election you participated in? 1980. Okay. And so basically that 1970s cohort, that kind of late baby boom cohort, the peak Republican cohort are the people who came of age during the Reagan administration, during the most important, the most successful Republican administration of the 20th century. The thing to note, though, is how things are changing since then. So for a period of 50 years, every new birth cohort that came into the American electorate was more Republican and less Democratic than the cohort that preceded it. And so over a very long time, we basically had new Republicans, okay, replacing old Democrats. So cohort change was moving in favor of the Republicans for a very, very long time. And we can now see pretty distinctly, and these numbers are much more secure as we've accumulated more elections since that time, the 1970s cohort and the 1980s cohort have sharply broken toward Democratic partisanship. And so it's now the case that cohort replacement is favoring the Democrats. And so one important reason why there will be likely change is going to be because Democrats are going to start replacing Republicans in that cohort change. So, and we've seen indications of the effect of this already. I would maintain that one indication of this has been the rapidity with which the Republican candidates have started to run away from opposition to gay marriage and to gay rights. They're simply not talking about it as much. And if you've seen the public opinion data on things like gay marriage and gay rights, there's an enormous generational gradient on it. Older people are much less supportive than younger people. Younger people can't figure out what the big fuss is about. And so, you know, we're already seeing politicians kind of responding to this change in the orientations of the electorate. The other big change that's going to occur soon, and you've all sort of seen this before, is that the Hispanic percentage of the voting age population is increasing markedly. So basically, with every passing presidential election year, the percentage of the electorate, the percentage of the voting age population, not the electorate, the percentage of the voting age population that is Latino has been going up by about 3% a year, every presidential cycle, right? And it is projected to go on still further into 2040, 2050, when over a quarter of the population will be Latino. And the difference this makes, of course, is that over the time we've been able to sort of track this, Latinos have been about 60 to 40% likely to support Democratic candidates over Republican candidates. So we've seen not only that younger voters are now trending toward Democratic partisanship, we've seen that Latino voters, rising in importance in the electorate, have also been trending toward Democratic politics. Now, this doesn't mean that Latino vote is guaranteed for the Democrats in the future. And as you can see, in 2004, George W. Bush did very, very well among Latino voters, and he also did in 2000. So this isn't something that's guaranteed to be in favor of the Democrats. The other thing to notice, however, is that the pattern actually hasn't changed very much over the entire 40 years that we've had these data. This is actually from exit polls, so we're looking at the way people are actually making their voting choices. What this means in terms of partisan polarization is that change will be led by the imperatives of presidential politics. So over time, okay, as the kind of Democratic-leaning part of the population increases, the Republicans will have to respond in some way, okay? And the way that they're going to want to respond, if they're going to try to keep winning elections, is to move toward the center. And I'll elaborate on that in just a moment. However, it's going to take some time for all of this to work its way through Congress. And that's because Congress is sort of set up differently from the president. In the United States Senate, for instance, as all of you will know, a third of the membership of the Senate is elected in every 2-year cycle. And the Senate is divided into 3 different electoral classes, Class 1, 2, and 3. The last election for Class 1, 2, and 3 is listed there, and the next up is listed there as well. The next class that will be elected is Class 3 in 2016. And it turns out that there are enormous differences between the states that elect senators in some class years and the states that elect senators in other class years. The most important difference is that the percentage of the voting age population that has a Senate race is only a little over half in Class 2 years and nearly 3/4 in Class 1 and Class 3 years. And so Class 2 years, including 2014, the midterm election just passed, in those years we have a very small share of the electorate that's taking part, an even less representative share of the electorate than we have in Class 1 and Class 3 years. This has partisan implications. Part of the reason the Republicans did so well in 2014 was, first of all, that there were more Democrats who were defending seats than there were Republicans, and secondly, that the seats were concentrated in the South. Okay, that is, the classes were sort of allocated according to what they needed to fill when states came into the Union. And so they're not sort of evenly divided among all the different class years. As you can see, the South elects a disproportionate number of its senators, disproportionate number of states, 12, elect their senators in Class 2 years relative to the other years. Well, in the next election cycle, the worm is going to turn, because in 2016, 24 Republican seats will be up for grabs, and only 10 Democratic seats will be up for grabs. So the Republicans will be defending much more of their territory. Moreover, where they'll especially be defending their territory is in the West. So Class 3 years are ones where states in the West, which have been trending toward the Democrats, have been most successful. So for a considerable number of years, I think we'll see a situation where there's a kind of balance between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. Either one can kind of take control. Neither one is necessarily going to dominate, but the Democrats are probably slightly favored over that long term. Situation looks very, very different in the House. For a long time now, it's been the case that the number of districts that are won by candidates of the party that are disfavored by the partisan balance has been declining. So what this is, the way that we assess partisan balance here is basically by asking, well, how do the congressional districts vote in presidential elections? And then we average them over some period of time. And so for a long, long time, you can see that lots and lots of Democrats managed to get themselves elected in Republican districts, and that at least a good number of Republicans got themselves elected in Democratic districts. The important thing to note here is that peaked in the 1970s, and it's been declining ever since. The problem for the Democrats is that this has been going on for a long time, and now that there's a close correspondence between people's partisanship, okay, and the partisan balance in districts and the candidates who represent, or the representatives who represent them in those districts in Congress, this is something that would indicate that the prospects for change in the House are going to be very, very slow to occur. So this basically shows the partisan balance in congressional districts over about a 70-year period from 1952 to 2012. The important thing to note here is that the natural majority in the House of Representatives is now the Republican Party. That is, if you look there, about half of the Republicans are in districts, or about half of the seats are districts that favor Republicans in the partisan balance. Versus only about 40%, a little over 40% for the Democrats. You can see that the percentage that are actually up for grabs, the neutrals, has been declining over time. Okay? But the important thing to note here is that the natural majority in the United States House of Representatives is the Republican Party. The other thing to note is that this has been going on for a very long time. It's been the case for 40 years, in fact, that the natural balance has favored the Republican Party. What has changed is the ability of Democrats to win in Republican districts. That has changed, and that's something that isn't going to be changed by these changes in partisan politics. I can come back and talk a little bit more about why that's the case. Why is it that the Republicans are more favored in the House of Representatives? Why is it that the Democrats are more favored in presidential and senatorial elections? But let me conclude, and then I'll say a little bit more about those in response to questions. So, What is the road then over time to moderation? Well, the first point is that we're not likely ever to return to the bipartisan politics of the 50s to the 70s. Okay, those days are long gone. That was a bipartisan politics that existed because conservative Southerners joined Republicans. Okay, that was largely what was going on. There were a few Northern Republicans who joined Democrats on various things, but those folks don't exist anymore. After the 2014 election, there is only one Democrat who represents a rural district in the South. One. Okay. Enormous change since it was before. Actually, her name is Gwen Graham. She's the son of former Senator Graham, or the daughter of former Senator Graham. So we're not likely to go back to a situation where partisanship or where bipartisanship is easy. However, we are likely to return to a time when the parties can in fact work together. And the reason for that, as we've already seen, is that the Republicans have hitched their wagon to a part of the electorate that is in decline. Okay. It's not just that the electorate is becoming brown, okay, and the Republicans have really sort of put their stake in with white voters, but it's also the case that as younger voters come in, they, as we have seen, are going to be more Democratic than the older voters who they are replacing. And so just as the Democrats did in embracing labor and liberalism during the New Deal generation, the Republicans over time, okay, are going to need to reposition themselves if they're going to have some hopes of gaining the presidency. So the Democrats faced their crisis in the 1960s and 1970s and finally repositioned themselves with Bill Clinton in the 1990s. But it took them 30 years to do it. So as you'll remember, in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, there was enormous warfare within the Democratic Party between the kind of moderate version of the Democratic Party represented by Clinton and Carter and people like that, and the liberals represented by people like Teddy Kennedy and Mario Cuomo. So there was internecine warfare for a period of 30 years. And finally what happened was that the Democrats got tired of losing presidential elections. That's essentially what happened. So by the 1990s, people like Ted Kennedy were willing to embrace Bill Clinton. Okay. Not because they particularly liked the policies that Bill Clinton had, but rather it was going to be a heck of a lot better to elect a Bill Clinton with moderate policies than to elect a George Bush Sr. With more conservative policies. We're likely to see the same kind of thing play out in about the same time frame with the Republicans. The Republicans have lost the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 elections. Barack Obama won a majority in both of his electoral campaigns in 2008 and 2012. The last time any Democrat did that was Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 and 1944. And so there is, in fact, a building trend toward Democratic voting in national elections. And so the parties will adjust. The Democrats will adjust. The Republicans will adjust as the Democrats adjusted in the 1960s and 1970s. It's not going to happen in 2016. It's going to happen over a longer time frame than that. But they're going to adjust in the same way that the electorate changes, which is over a very long period of time. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions.
In the 1950s, 60s, and into the early 70s, there was a time of tremendous economic growth and development. Mm-hmm. Has your studies shown any correlation between the economic state and the willingness of bipartisanship?
Well, I have 2 answers to that. One is that one of the arguments that people have made about the decline of the New Deal coalition was precisely that in the prosperous period after the Second World War, voters saw less reason to really support the Democrats. They were enjoying a fair bit of growth. They were seeing growth in their incomes, and it made them more interested in the kinds of things that the Republican Party had to offer than, say, their fathers and mothers who had lived through the Great Depression. So part of the movement toward the Republican Party by the baby boom generation was exactly that they were coming of age in much more affluent circumstances than their parents and grandparents had come of age. So that was a piece of it. There's some research out there that people I know have done who actually raise a connection between partisan polarization and the rise in inequality in the electorate. And it's kind of a complex argument. But there is that argument out there that as the income distribution has become more divided, if you will, greater concentration of wealth at the upper income levels, that in fact has also helped to polarize our politics. So there does seem to be some connection, or at least arguably there's some connection between kind of the economic circumstances people find themselves in and the balance of power between the parties. Hold on for the microphone. We'll move toward the back.
Thank you. First of all, it was really refreshing and exciting to see all the quantitative material in your slides. There are many presentations like this that don't have a lot of quantitative material, but that's very, very refreshing and exciting to see. But there's some other things going on that I would have expected to see in these numbers that I didn't see. And I wonder if you could help me understand why they didn't show up. One is that with the exception of the military, every other social institution in the country is in a period of declining credibility. So there has never been a lower opinion of Congress. There has never been a lower opinion of presidents. There's never been a lower opinion of organized labor. There's never been a lower opinion of captains of industries. One would think that this would produce a rise in independence, which we didn't see. Secondly, we now for the first time have a truly national economy. People move all over the country. Very few people live where they were born. We have national media, we have national stores. One would think this would drive a reduction in partisanism generally, a reduction in any correlation between geography and partisanism. And again, I didn't see that in the numbers.
Okay, let me start with independents. Independents are kind of interesting sort here. So the way that the National Election Studies asks about partisan identification, it's a two-part question. The first question is, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or something else? And so in the first sort, people either say, well, I'm a Democrat or a Republican, or they say, well, I'm an independent. If they say they're a Democrat or a Republican, then they're asked a follow-up question that is basically designed to get at how strongly they identify as Republicans or Democrats. And so they're asked, do you consider yourself a strong Republican or a not very strong Republican, or likewise for Democrats? If they say that they're independents, then the follow-up question is to ask them, do you tend to lean toward the Republicans, or do you tend to lean toward the Democrats? And it turns out that 80% of the people who say that they're independents will admit that they lean one way or another. So, in fact, most independents are actual kind of closet partisans, right? They sort of represent themselves as independents, but they're not independents, okay? That is, they're either sort of Republicans or Democrats. Moreover, if you look at the way that independent leaners, so independent Republicans, people who said that they were independents but then admit they lean to the Republicans, or independent Democrats, okay, if you look at the way they vote, it's exactly the same as the not-so-strong partisans. There's no difference at all, right? And so effectively what independent is for most people is that it's a posture, okay? It's a posture. It's basically people saying, well, I vote for the man or the woman rather than the party, but it just so happens the Republicans always have the better man or the woman, and so I end up and so that's why you don't see that. In point of fact, what has been happening over the last 30 years is that partisanship has gotten stronger. Okay. I'm oftentimes asked, what do you see as the likelihood of a third party? About 0 right now. And the reason is because the attachment to the political parties is back up to what it was in the 1950s. Okay, it's back up to people sort of being committed to a party one way or another. And so we haven't seen a rise in independence, in part because people have shifted, say, out of the they may have shifted out of saying, well, I'm a not so strong Republican, to being, well, I'm an independent, but I'll admit to leaning Republican. There's been that kind of shift, but there hasn't been any underlying shift in the way that they actually behave. So it's one of the really interesting things about these data. What you will see if you go back and look at it is that there was actually a rise for a time in the independent percentage. So the people down here listed as independent, there's so-called pure independents. These are the people who didn't say that they lean one way or another. As you can see, it peaked out in the 1970s. Okay, and since that time, it's been in decline. You can also see that over time, there's been a steady increase in birth cohorts claiming to be independents. And in fact, if you took this, this figure into the next birth cohort, the 1991 to 2000 birth cohort, mind you, the data here are pretty uncertain because there are exactly 125 people who were born in that period in the surveys that we have. What you'll see is a sharp increase in the number of people who call themselves independent. My guess is that will go away as they age a little bit further, and that we'll continue to see a move toward the Democrats in the new birth cohort. So we haven't seen much change in independence simply because the meaning of independence isn't quite what everyone thinks it is. By the way, this change has occurred at the same time that the percentage of people who say that they're independents on that first question has risen to about 40%. Right? It's just that 32% of them end up actually putting themselves into a partisan category when you ask the follow-up question. The question about mobility, I think, is also an interesting one. The kind of geographic mobility of the American population is pretty extraordinary, and the mobility, particularly sort of beginning in the mid part of the 20th century on, has been pretty extraordinary as well. That hasn't had the effect, though, of kind of creating homogeneity across the country, because with mobility has come, for reasons we don't fully understand, more and more sort of partisan sorting into residential situations. What we're finding over time is that the primary reason for the Republican advantage in the House of Representatives doesn't actually have anything to do with gerrymandering. Okay, even though the Republicans after the 2010 state legislative elections controlled redistricting in a way that they hadn't ever before for a very, very long time. So it's not mostly about redistricting. What's been happening over time in a very slow way is that the kinds of residential situations that people select into have been more and more correlated with partisanship. And so people's residential networks, the places where they live, have become much more homogeneous. They've become much more homogeneous in a way that's correlated with partisanship. And so that's why we haven't seen a whole lot of it. In fact, one of the neat things I didn't have time for here, another reason, the big reason why the Republicans are favored in the House of Representatives is because Democrats are a lot more residentially concentrated than Republicans are. And so here's a really nice study that a couple of people at Stanford did. This is just for Florida, but it's true for the entire country. And this is something that people have known for a while. The reason for the Republican advantage in Congress is because Democrats are much more concentrated in urban areas than Republicans are in rural areas. And this shows it very nicely. What the vertical bars are here, you'll see, it kind of looks like Miami skyscrapers. Those are actually kind of vertical bars. And what those vertical bars indicate is the correlation between the partisanship measured by presidential vote in that precinct and all the adjoining precincts. Okay, so what the correlation is between partisanship in this area and the immediately surrounding areas. And as you can see, that correlation is very, very high in the Democratic parts of the state, and it's very, very low in the Republican parts of the state. So that's the main thing, is that the Republicans are just spread around the country better than the Democrats are. And part of that has been self-segregation. Part of that has been people choosing residential situations that are more comfortable for them, that happen to be associated with partisanship. And part of that is because there is a very strong sort of urban-rural difference between Republicans and Democrats now that's only become stronger as the South has become Democratic, or it has become Republican. All right, Jim? Hold for the mic.
So I'm curious about this increased dedication to a particular party that you said hasn't really been seen since the 50s. Mm-hmm. Put that together with that gentleman's observation that we've never been at such lows for approval for certain parties. Mm-hmm. I don't really understand how those two go together. particularly since I've never met a single person who's like, yeah, I love those Democrats, or wow, those Republicans are doing a great job. I feel like most people, at least in my younger cohort from 80s onward, would be so pumped about a third party that was actually viable because they're more attached to being liberals or being conservatives than to being Democrats or Republicans.
Well, there's an old finding in the literature on the U.S. Congress, and it came up from a guy named Richard Fenno. Fenno's method of operation in his research was to tag around with members of Congress as they ran for office. Very, very interesting study. So he just kind of follows people around and kind of watches them. How do they actually interact with voters? And one of the things that he found was that members of Congress run for Congress by running against Congress. That is, they know that the institution is unpopular, right? And what they try to do is to separate themselves from the institution, right? Well, they're all a bunch of knaves and scoundrels, but you can count on me, right? And what we find, in fact, is that if you ask people, do you support or oppose Congress, or even the Republican majority in Congress, or the Democratic minority in Congress, or what have you, do you support or oppose, those numbers are very, very low. But if you ask people, do you support or not support your member of Congress, those numbers are very, very high. And so it's essentially a collective responsibility sort of thing, right? That the whole system is set up where individuals can set themselves up separately from the institution itself. They don't actually have to take responsibility for the institution. It turns out that lately the polling has moved a little bit to where people are more likely to say that they disapprove of the positions or the performance of their own member of Congress as well as of Congress. It's still much higher than Congress as a whole, much higher than either of the parties in Congress. What I think is happening there is basically partisans coming out. That Republican partisans are more likely to be willing to criticize a Democratic member of Congress from their district and vice versa. So it's sort of shown up there in a little bit. But a big part of it is that the institutions themselves, there's no one who really has any personal stake in defending the integrity or defending the kind of the image of the institution. One more?
Thank you. You mentioned gerrymandering.
Yes.
One theory I heard I'd like you to comment on is that the proportion of safe seats for each party is so high that in many districts the real campaign, the real election is in the primaries, which tends to pull candidates to be more extreme, less moderate, but both parties, because they're more vulnerable to challenges from the extreme wings of their parties that will punish them for being moderate or for reaching across the aisle. Does that bear out in the data?
It's a little more complicated than that. So first of all, your observation about how the seats in Congress have become safer for one party or another is exactly right. It turns out that it's not because members of Congress are safer in their elections than they were before. So this shows the incumbent re-election rates for both the House and the Senate from 46 to 2014. And as you can see, incumbent members of the House are about 90 to 95% likely to be reelected if they run for reelection, and incumbent members of the Senate are about 85% likely to be reelected if they run for reelection, and that hasn't changed in 20 years, right? So it's not a matter where incumbents are becoming safer than it was before. Rather, what's happening is that the kind of correspondence between the policy positions of voters, kind of the partisanship of the voters, and the partisanship of the person who represents them has been increasing over time. And so as you can see here, the green bar are incumbent members of Congress, these are in percent, who are in districts that are favorable to their own party. That is, on the basis of presidential voting, they're in districts. If they're Republicans, they're in Republican districts. If they're Democrats, they're in Democratic districts. So you can see a couple of things. One is that while the number of neutral districts has, in fact, declined over time, that's the yellow, the number of neutral districts, percentage of neutral districts has declined over time. What has really changed is the number of members of Congress who are in districts that favor the opposite party. That's what's really declined over time, and most of those are Democrats. Okay, so that's the main thing that's changed over time, is that Democrats used to be able to win Republican-leaning districts, and they're not able to win Republican-leaning districts any longer. There have been a number of studies of differential turnout and turnout in primaries. The overall finding from that is not supportive of the notion that primaries are what's causing polarization. So, for instance, some colleagues of mine, we have some data about partisan primaries that go back back to the early 20th century. And what these colleagues did was they did a study basically looking at whether the kind of policy positions of members of Congress changed after the introduction of primaries. And what they found was basically it had no effect, that it wasn't something that was really causing things to happen in a particular way. So that doesn't seem to be a big part in polarization. There certainly are arguments out there like that, but right now I would say the evidence really doesn't favor that very much. So thank you all very much. Be happy to stay behind and answer any other questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, for that really fascinating